third graders. So I'm in my running gear because I'm going to go for a run after this because it's really important right now that you guys are getting outside and getting some exercise just like me. I'm still training for my half marathon. So don't mind me wearing my running stuff right away. Today we're gonna focus on making better predictions. So what we're going to do as I keep reading our A to Z mystery on the absent author is we really want to think about making some predictions based on some of the clues that we have from our story. And so far, I'm going to do a little recap. So we have Dink, right? He and his friends, Josh and Ruth Rose, they're at the bookstore, hoping and waiting for Wallace Wallace to come to meet with everybody at the bookstore. Mr. Paskey, the gentleman that works there, he's really nervous because Wallace Wallace isn't coming. And so what we have to think about, is Mr. Paskey a suspect because he's all nervous? And does that mean that he maybe had something to do with Wallace Wallace being missing? Or is he just nervous because all of these people are there waiting to see Wallace Wallace and he's not there? And that would be kind of frustrating if you're working at the bookstore and all these people are there ready for something to happen and he's not there. So what we're going to do is keep paying attention to suspects. But then what we're going to think about is if there are any clues, why might this person be part of the crime? What's their motive? And I'll keep talking about that as we keep reading because we have quite a bit to read today. So we're on chapter 3 already. And right now, Dink is worried because in his letter that he got from Wallace Wallace, he said that he would be there short. He said, I will be there short of being kidnapped, which seems very suspicious. So now Dink is assuming since he's not there, that must mean that he was kidnapped. So kidnapped, Ruth Rose shrieked and her blue eyes were huge. Josh and Dink covered their ears. Shh, said Josh. He handed the letter back to Dink and gave a quick gesture with his head. Some strange woman is watching us. Dink had noticed the woman earlier. She'd been sitting in the back of the book nook. She's coming over here, Ruth said. So here's this lady looking at them. So the woman had brown hair up in a neat bun, half glasses perched on her nose. She's wearing a brown dress and brown shoes and carried a book bag with a picture of a moose on the side. Around her neck, she wore a red scarf covered with tiny black letters. Excuse me, she said in a soft, trembly voice. Did you say Wallace Wallace has been kidnapped? The woman poked her glasses nervously. Dink wasn't sure what to say. He thought Wallace Wallace had been kidnapped, but he couldn't be sure. Finally, he said, well, he might have been. My goodness, gasped the woman. Who are you? Josh asked her. Oh, pardon me, the woman blushed. My name is Mavis Green, she mumbled. I'm a writer, and I came to meet Mr. Wallace. Dink said, I'm Dink Duncan. These are my friends, Ruth, Rose, and Josh. Mavis shook hands shyly. Then she reached into her book bag and pulled out a folded paper. Wallace Wallace wrote to me last week. He said something very peculiar in his letter. I didn't think much of it at the time, but when he didn't show up today, and then I heard you mention kidnapping. She handed the letter to Dink. Josh and Ruth Rose read it over his shoulder. Dear Mavis, thank you for your note. I'm well, and thank you for asking. But lately, my imagination is playing tricks on me. I keep thinking I'm being followed. Maybe that's what happens to mystery writers. We start seeing bad guys in the shadows. At any rate, I'm eager to meet you in Green Lawn, and I look forward to our lunch after the signing. Wallace Wallace. Whoa, said Ruth Rose. First he says he's being followed, and then he winds up missing. Dink told Mavis about his letter from Wallace Wallace. He said the only thing that would keep him from coming today is if he was kidnapped. Oh dear, said Mavis. I just don't understand. Why would anyone want to kidnap Wallace Wallace? If he's the most famous mystery writer in the world, he must be rich, right? Josh said. Maybe someone kidnapped him for a ransom. Suddenly, Josh grabbed Dink and spun him around, pointing toward the street. Look, the cops are coming! They must have heard about the kidnapping. A police officer was walking toward them. Josh, that's Officer Fallon, Jimmy Fallon's grandfather, said Dink. Jimmy came to get a book signed. I saw him inside the book nook. Maybe we should show Officer Fallon these letters, Ruth Rose suggested. It could be clues if Wallace Wallace had really been kidnapped. Who's been kidnapped? Asked Officer Fallon, who was now standing near them. Not my grandson, I hope, he added, grinning. Dink showed Officer Fallon the 2 letters. We think Wallace Wallace might have been kidnapped, he said. He promised he'd come to sign books, but he isn't here. Officer Fallon read Mavis's letter first, then Dink's. He scratched his chin, then handed the letters back. The letters do sound a bit suspicious, he said, but it's more likely that Mr. Wallace just missed his flight. Jimmy Fallon ran out of the book nook, waving a Wallace Wallace book at his grandfather. Grandpa, he never came. Can we go for ice cream anyway? Officer Fallon put a big hand on Jimmy's head. In a minute, son. To Dink, he said, I wouldn't worry. Mr. Wallace will turn up. Call me tomorrow if there's no news, okay? They watched Jimmy and his grandfather walk away. Dink handed Mavis's letter back to her. He folded his and slid it into his pocket. Crazy thoughts were bouncing around in his head. What if Wallace Wallace really has been kidnapped? It happened because I invited him to Greenlawn. I'm practically an accomplice. That means he's like part of making something bad happen. I don't want to wait till tomorrow, he said finally. I say we start looking for Wallace Wallace now. Where do we start? Ruth Rose asked. Dink jerked his thumb over to his shoulder. Right here at the book nook. Excuse me, Mavis Green said shyly. May I come along too? Sure, Dink said. He marched back inside the book nook with the others following. So Mr. Paskey was putting the Wallace Wallace books back on his shelf. He looked even more nervous than before. Excuse me, Mr. Paskey, Dink said. Have you heard from Wallace Wallace? Mr. Paskey's hand shot up to his bow tie. No, Dink, not a word. We think he was kidnapped, Josh said. Mr. Paskey swallowed, making his bow tie wiggle. Now, Joshua, let's not jump to conclusions. I'm sure there's a rational explanation for his absence. Dink told Mr. Paskey about the 2 letters. I'm really worried, Mr. Paskey. Where could he be? Mr. Paskey took out a handkerchief and wiped his face. I have no idea. He removed a paper from his desk and handed it to Dink. All I have is his itinerary. The others looked over Dink's shoulder as he read. So there's his itinerary. This is what's supposed to happen for him today. 1. Arrive at Bradley Airport at 7 p.m. Friday, July 15th. From New England Airlines Flight 3132. Meet driver from Lawrence Taxi Service. Drive to Sri Lanka Hotel. Shangri-La Hotel. Sign books at Book Nook at 11 a.m. Saturday, July 16th. Lunch, then back to airport for 4:30 flight. Can I keep this? Dink asked Mr. Paskey. Mr. Paskey blinked. Well, I guess that'll be all right. But why would you need the itinerary? Dink picked up a marker and drew circles around the words airport, taxi, hotel, and Book Nook. This is like a trail. It leads from the airport last night to the Book Nook today, Dink said. Somewhere along this trail, Wallace Wallace disappeared. Dink stared at the itinerary, and we're going to find him. Because it says here, yesterday he was supposed to get here from the airport. So there should be he should have already gotten there. He should have taken a taxi and then gone to the hotel. Then the Book Nook was for this day. So they're trying to figure out, did he ever arrive from the airport? So we're going to start chapter 4 and keep on thinking, because we have some new characters, right? We have met, and I'll add her later, we met Mavis, and then we also met Officer Fallon. So those are some new people to consider as we keep reading. So chapter 4. So Mr. Paskey shooed them out of the Book Nook and locked the front door. I have to eat lunch, he said. He scurried down Main Street. Come on, Dink said. There's a phone in Ellie's diner. Good, we can eat while you're calling. Josh stopped. Who are you calling? The airport, Dink said, to see if Wallace Wallace was on that 7 o'clock flight last night. They walked into Ellie's diner just as Jimmy Fallon and his grandfather came out. Jimmy was working on a triple-decker chocolate cone. Ellie stood behind the counter. As usual, her apron was smeared with ketchup, mustard, chocolate, and a lot of stuff Dink didn't recognize. Ellie smiled. Hi, Dink. Butter crunch, right? Dink shook his head. No, thanks, Ellie. I came to use the phone. Excuse me, but would it be all right if I bought you each a cone? Mavis Green asked. I was going to buy lunch for Mr. Wallace anyway. Gee, thanks, Josh said. I'll have a scoop of mint chip and a scoop of pistachio. Oh, you like green ice cream too, Mavis said. She smiled shyly. I'll have the same, please. I like pink ice cream. Ruth Rose said. I'll have a strawberry cone, please, 1 scoop. How about you, Dink? Mavis asked. I'm not hungry, thanks, he said. But you guys go ahead. I'm going to call the airport. Dink felt guilty. If he hadn't invited Wallace Wallace to Greenlawn, his favorite author would be safe at home in his castle in Maine. So here's everybody at the diner. But Dink couldn't help feeling excited too. He felt like a detective from one of Wallace Wallace's books. Dink stepped into the phone booth, looked up the number for New England Airlines, and called. When a voice came on, he asked if Wallace Wallace had been aboard Flight 3132 last night. He was? Did it land at 7 o'clock? Dink asked. Thanks a lot. He rushed out of the phone booth. Hey guys, they told me Wallace Wallace was on the plane, and it landed right on time. So he didn't miss his flight, Ruth Rose said through strawberry pink lips. That's right. Dink pulled out the itinerary. He drew a line through airport. This is so exciting, Ruth Rose said. Now what? Josh asked, working on his double dipper. Dink pointed to his next circle on the itinerary. Now we need to find out if a taxi picked him up, he said. Lauren's taxi is just over by the river, Ruth Rose said. Dink looked at Mavis. Would you like to come with us? We can walk there in 5 minutes. Mavis Green wiped her lips carefully with a napkin. I'd love to come, she said in her soft voice. They left Ellie's diner, walked left on Bridge Lane, then headed down Woodview Road toward the river. Mr. Paskey looked rather upset, didn't he? Josh said, crunching the last of his cone. His chin was green. Wouldn't you be upset if you had a bunch of customers at your store waiting to meet a famous author and he didn't show up? Ruth Rose asked. I agree with Ruth. Yeah, but he was sweating buckets, Josh said. I wonder if Mr. Paskey kidnapped Wallace Wallace. Remember, he used his handkerchief to kind of dab himself, so that's why they're saying he's sweating a lot. And if you're sweating a lot, maybe you might feel guilty about something and nervous that you're going to get caught. Josh, get real. Why would Mr. Paskey kidnap an author? Asked Ruth Rose. He sells tons of Wallace Wallace's books. I don't think Mr. Paskey is the kidnapper, Dink said. But in a way, Josh is right. Detectives should consider everyone a suspect, just the way they do in Wallace Wallace books. At River Road, they turned left. 2 minutes later, Dink pushed open the door of the Lawrence Taxi Service office. He asked the man behind the counter if one of their drivers had met Flight 3132 at Bradley Airport the previous night. The man ran his finger down a list on a clipboard. That would be Maureen Higgins. She's out back eating her lunch, he said, pointing over his shoulder. Walk straight through. They cut through the building to a grassy area and back. Through the trees, Dink could see the Indian River. The sun reflected off the water like bright coins. A woman was sitting at a picnic table eating a sandwich and filling in a crossword puzzle. Excuse me, are you Maureen Higgins? Dink asked. The woman shook her head without looking up. Nope, I'm Marilyn Monroe. She's being sassy and silly. The woman wrote in another letter. Then she looked up. She had the merriest blue eyes Dink had ever seen. Yeah, cutie pie, I'm Maureen. She pointed her sandwich at Dink. And who might you be? I'm Dink Duncan, he said. These are my friends, Josh, Ruth Rose, and Mavis. We wondered if you could help us, Ruth Rose said. Maureen stared at them. How? Did you pick up a man named Wallace Wallace at the airport last night? Dink asked. Maureen squinted one of her blue eyes. Why do you want to know? 'Cause he's missing, said Josh. Well, I sure ain't got him. Maureen took a bite out of her sandwich. Mayonnaise oozed onto her fingers. Maureen nodded, swallowing. Sure, I picked him up, 7 o'clock sharp. I was there with my sign saying Wallace. The guy spots me, trots over. I take him out in my taxi. He climbs in, carrying a small suitcase. Kind of spooky guy. Dressed in a hat, long raincoat, sunglasses. Sunglasses at night. Doesn't speak a word, just sits. Spooky. Okay, so that does seem mysterious. Why is he wearing sunglasses at night with this long raincoat? So that seems kind of odd. And one of the other things that seems kind of interesting that I think we should pay attention to is how they say consider in Wallace Wallace's books that detectives should consider everyone a suspect. So we should start to think about everyone we've met and whether they are a suspect. So did you take him to the Shangri-La Hotel? Dink asked. Yep, those were my orders. Guy didn't have to give directions, but it would have been nice if he'd said something. Pass the time, you know. A lot of people, they chat just to act friendly. Not this one, quiet as a mouse in the back seat. Maureen wiped mayonnaise from her fingers and lips. Who's this Wallace fella anyway? He's a famous writer, Ruth Rose said. Maureen's mouth fell open. You mean I had a celebrity in my cab and never even knew it? What happened when you got to the hotel? Josh asked. Maureen stood up and tossed her napkin into the trash. I get on my side, then I open his door, he hops out, hands me a 20, last I seen, he's scooting into the lobby. Dink pulled out the itinerary. He crossed out taxi with a thick black line. Then he drew a question mark next to hotel. Thanks a lot, Miss Higgins, he said. Come on, guys. I have a feeling we're getting closer to finding Wallace Wallace. Maureen put her hand on Dink's arm. I just thought of something, she said. When he handed me my fare, this Wallace fellow was smiling. Dink stared at Maureen. Smiling? She nodded. Yep, had a silly grin on his face, like he knew some big secret or something.